The bells had already started ringing when Delia Fenmore dragged her left foot across the cobblestones and prayed to every god she'd ever heard of that no one was watching too closely. She'd practiced this 3 nights in her bedroom above the bakery, limping back and forth between the flour barrels and the window until she could make it look natural. Not too dramatic. Not a full collapse or a wince with every step. Just a hitch. A subtle wrongness in her gait that said damaged, useless, not worth presenting. The kind of limp that would make the selection attendants mark her name off the registry and wave her toward the back of the hall with the other women deemed unsuitable for the Alpha King's consideration. The grand ceremonial hall rose before her like a beast made of pale stone and ambition. Banners hung from every column, deep charcoal and bronze, the Greyford crest stitched in thread that caught the morning sun. Women streamed through the arched entrance in gowns they'd been sewing for months, hair pinned and curled and braided with flowers, cheeks flushed with hope, or nerves, or both. Delia wore a plain dress the color of oatmeal. She'd chosen it deliberately. Nothing that would catch an eye. Nothing that would suggest she wanted to be here, because she didn't. She'd been 12 the last time a selection ceremony had come to the capital. Old enough to watch her mother stand in the lineup with 200 other women while the previous alpha assessed them like livestock, walking down the row, pausing at faces that pleased him, passing over ones that didn't. Her mother had stood perfectly still with her shoulders back and her chin high and her hands trembling at her sides. And the alpha had looked straight through her as though she were made of glass. Her mother had come home that night and sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours without speaking. Delia had found her there when she came downstairs for water, sitting in the dark with her hands flat on the flour-dusted surface, staring at nothing. She'd never fully come back from that night. Something in her had dimmed, gone quiet, as though being looked through had taught her she was transparent, and she'd simply accepted it. Delia had sworn she would never stand in that line. She adjusted her limp as she reached the entrance, left foot dragging slightly, weight shifted to her right hip. Convincing. Practiced. She joined the stream of women and kept her eyes down and her shoulders curved inward, making herself as small and forgettable as a baker's daughter in an oatmeal dress could be. The hall was enormous. Vaulted ceilings painted with hunting scenes and wolf motifs, chandeliers dripping with candles that threw warm light across marble floors. The center aisle was roped with braided cord, creating a pathway from the entrance to the raised dais at the far end where a single chair sat empty. Waiting. Women were being sorted. Delia could see it happening. Attendants in crisp uniforms moved through the crowd with lists and sharp eyes, directing women to the left, the presentation line, or to the right, the observation gallery, where the unsuitable, the too old, the too young, the visibly infirm, were ushered with polite finality. She angled toward the right, kept limping. Almost there. Name? An attendant materialized in front of her. Young, efficient, a bronze pin on her collar that marked her as part of the high ceremony mistress's staff. Delia Fenmore. The attendant scanned her list. Found the name. Her eyes dropped to Delia's leg. Injury? Old one, Delia said, keeping her voice flat. Practiced. The hip never set right. I can stand, but not for long, and not in the presentation line. I'll be more comfortable in the gallery. The attendant hesitated. Glanced down at her list again, then at Delia's leg, then at the gallery entrance 15 feet away. Delia held her breath. Gallery, to your right. Relief flooded through her so fast her actual knees went weak. She nodded, ducked her head, and turned toward the gallery entrance with her heart hammering and her fake limp suddenly feeling very real because her whole body was shaking with the effort of holding itself together. 10 feet. 5. She could see the gallery benches, the other women already seated, the blessed anonymity of the back rows where no one would look at her, and no one would assess her, and no one would walk past her like she wasn't there. 3 feet. A voice cut across the hall. Not loud, not shouting, but carrying, the way a blade carries through air, clean and unavoidable. That one, in the back, the one limping. Delia froze. The hall didn't go silent all at once. It was a rolling thing, a wave of quiet that started at the dais and spread outward. Conversations dying mid-sentence, heads turning, 200 women and 50 attendants redirecting their attention toward the far end of the hall, where a man had just descended from the dais and was walking. No, striding. Directly toward her. She couldn't see his face at first. The light was behind him, turning him into a silhouette, broad shoulders and a long stride, and something about the way he moved that made the air in the hall feel heavier, denser, like the room itself was adjusting to accommodate his presence. Then he stepped out of the backlight and Delia's stomach dropped. He was younger than she'd expected. Late 20s maybe, with dark walnut-brown hair that fell in a side-swept wave across his forehead, and a jaw cut so sharply it looked designed to deliver bad news. He wore a charcoal coat with bronze buttons that matched the crest on the banners, and his eyes were the color of dark pewter, cool and deep and unreadable, except for the way they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin prickle from her scalp to the soles of her feet. The Alpha King called her Greyford. He was looking at her. No, he was walking toward her. Her mind went blank. Then it went into overdrive. She needed to commit to the limp. She needed to look pained, look damaged, look like someone he wouldn't want within 10 feet of his selection. She shifted her weight harder onto her right hip. Winced. Let her face tighten with convincing discomfort. He stopped in front of her. Close. Close enough that she could smell cedar and wood smoke and something warm underneath, like sun-heated leather. Your leg, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. Rougher, like gravel wrapped in velvet. And there was something in his expression she couldn't name. Not pity, not suspicion exactly, but an alertness, a watching. It's an old injury, Your Majesty. She kept her eyes down, kept her voice small. I was told I could sit in the gallery. Which hip? The left. He studied her for a moment that lasted approximately 17 years. Then something shifted in those pewter eyes. A glint. Not cruel. Warmer than that. Almost amused. You've been favoring your right side since you entered the hall, he said conversationally, except when you paused to adjust your shoe near the third column. You put your full weight on your left leg for 4 seconds without flinching. Pauses. Would you like to try again? The floor opened beneath her. Not literally, but the sensation was the same. That lurch of free fall. That moment when every carefully constructed lie collapsed at once, and there was nothing beneath you but the truth, and a very long drop. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. Nothing came out. Around them, the hall had gone absolutely still. 200 women watching, 50 attendants frozen mid-task, a chandelier's worth of candlelight flickering across the face of the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, who was standing 3 feet from a baker's daughter in an oatmeal dress who had just been caught faking a limp to avoid being presented to him. She started. He didn't wait for the rest. He bent, smoothly, efficiently, like a man accustomed to making decisions faster than anyone around him could object. One arm went behind her knees, the other wrapped around her back, and before Delia could process what was happening, her feet left the floor. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, settled her against his chest with a casual strength that made her entire body go rigid, and then he turned and walked. Toward the front, toward the dais, toward the presentation line. What are you doing? She hissed. Carrying you, he said, since your leg is so injured. Put me down. You can barely walk. I saw the limp. That was... You just said you knew it was... I said no such thing. His eyes cut to hers. Dark pewter, unreadable and very close. I said you put weight on your left leg for 4 seconds. That's a medical observation, not an accusation. She stared at him. He stared back. And something happened in her chest that she did not have a name for. A settling. A shift. Like a compass needle swinging toward north. Her hands, which had been trembling against his coat, went still. Completely still. She didn't notice. He did. His stride hitched for half a beat, his gaze dropping to her hands where they rested against the bronze buttons of his coat. Still as stone. Still as water. For the first time in her 23 years, Delia Fenmore's hands were not shaking. He set her down at the front of the presentation line, gently. His hands lingered at her waist for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, steadying her, and the warmth of his palms through the thin oatmeal-colored fabric sent a ripple through her that she felt in the base of her skull. "Stay," he said quietly, just to her. "Please." Then he returned to the dais, sat in the chair, and the selection ceremony began. Delia stood in the front of the line with her face burning and her heart slamming and her hands, inexplicably, impossibly still. The ceremony lasted 4 hours. Delia spent most of it furious. Not at the process, though the process was its own particular kind of humiliation. Women stepping forward one at a time, stating their name and lineage, standing under the gaze of the Alpha King while he asked them a question, or didn't, and then being directed to one side of the hall or the other. Considered. Or dismissed. She was furious at herself, for getting caught. For standing here in the front of the line where everyone could see her, where the high ceremony mistress, a sharp-featured woman named Lyrian Orvan, with cold, silver-gray eyes and a mouth that looked like it had been designed specifically for delivering disappointing news, kept glancing at her with an expression that said Delia's presence was a personal insult. She was furious at him. For seeing through her, for carrying her. For the way he'd said please like it was a word he didn't use often and had chosen specifically for this moment. When her turn came, she stepped forward with her chin up and her jaw tight and no trace of a limp. "Delia Fenmore," she said. "Baker." A ripple went through the hall. The presentation line was supposed to be nobility and high-ranking families. A Baker had never been presented. Lyrian Orvain's expression curdled. Calder leaned forward in his chair. Those pewter eyes found hers. And she felt that settling again, that anchor drop in her chest, and her hands went still at her sides. "Why did you fake the limp, Delia Fenmore?" The hall held its breath. She could have lied, could have deflected, demurred, offered some pretty excuse about nerves or modesty. Instead, she looked at the most powerful man in the Northern Territories and told him the truth. "Because my mother stood in a line like this one 15 years ago, and the Alpha who came before you looked through her like she was nothing. She went home and sat in the dark for 3 hours, and something in her broke that night that never healed. Her voice didn't waver, her hands didn't shake. I swore I would never stand in this line. I would never give anyone the power to look through me." Silence. Absolute. The kind that presses against your eardrums. Calder's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something deep and careful, like a door being opened in a room that had been locked for a long time. "And now you're standing in it." "You didn't give me much choice." "No." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "I didn't." He held her gaze for a long moment. Considered. He directed her to the left side of the hall, the considered side. And Delia walked there on steady legs with steady hands and a heart that felt like it was trying to beat its way out of her chest. 3 days later, she was still in the palace. The selection had narrowed to 12 women. Delia had no idea why she was still among them. The other 11 were daughters of lords and territorial commanders, women who wore silk and spoke 3 languages and knew which fork to use at dinner. Delia knew how to score bread dough and calculate rise times in fluctuating oven temperatures. But every morning, the list was posted on the door of the women's quarters. And every morning, her name was on it. Lyrian Orvain was not pleased. The high ceremony mistress had made that abundantly clear through a series of increasingly pointed interactions, comments about proper protocol, questions about Delia's lineage asked in a tone that suggested the answer was already known and already inadequate, glances exchanged with other officials that communicated a shared certainty that this baker's daughter was a temporary aberration that would be corrected. On the third evening, Calder found Delia in the palace kitchen. She'd been restless. The guest chambers were too quiet, the bed too soft, the walls too close. She'd wandered until she found the kitchens, empty at this hour, and had been sitting on a stool near the bread ovens with her arms wrapped around her knees when the door opened and the Alpha King walked in wearing no coat, sleeves pushed to his elbows, looking like a man who'd been pacing his own halls for an hour before following the pull that had been tugging at his ribcage since the selection began. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't stand. "You're in my kitchen," he said. "Your kitchen has better ovens than mine." His mouth twitched. He came in, sat on the stool across from her. The kitchen was warm, lit by the dying glow of the bread ovens, and the light caught the walnut tones in his hair and turned his eyes from pewter to something softer, warmer, like river stones in late afternoon sun. "Your hands," he said. Delia looked down. Her hands were in her lap, fingers laced together, trembling slightly. The familiar shake, the one that had followed her since childhood, that made kneading difficult and icing impossible, and that she had learned to work around the way you work around a crack in a foundation, carefully, constantly, never quite forgetting it's there. "They always do that," she said. "Nerves. My mother had it too." "Not always." He was watching her hands with an expression she couldn't read. "When I carried you, when you stood in the line, they stopped." She frowned, tried to remember. He was right. She could feel the ghost of it. That stillness, that anchor drop, the trembling simply ceasing like a held breath released. "I don't know why," she said honestly. He looked at her, really looked, the way he had in the hall when she'd told him about her mother, like he was reading something written on her bones. "I do," he said quietly. And then, before she could ask what he meant, "Why bread?" Pauses. She blinked at the redirect. Then something in her chest loosened. "Because bread is honest," she said. "You can't fake it. You can't rush it. If you don't put in the time and the attention and the care, you taste it. Every single time." She ran her thumb along the edge of the stool. "And because when my mother came home that night and sat in the dark, I went downstairs the next morning and made bread. I was 12. I burned the first 3 loaves. But the 4th one rose. And when she smelled it, she came into the kitchen for the first time in 3 days. And she sat at the table. And she ate." The oven crackled. Something shifted between them. The air itself seemed to change weight, to settle into a new configuration that had Delia at one end and this quiet, watchful king at the other, connected by something she could feel but couldn't name. Delia. Her name in his mouth sounded different than she'd ever heard it. Heavier, more deliberate, like he was tasting the shape of it. "The ceremony mistress has filed a formal recommendation that you be removed from the selection. She's citing irregularity of presentation and lack of qualifying lineage." Her stomach dropped. "Oh, I denied the recommendation." She looked up. His jaw was tight. His hands, she noticed, were curled into fists on his knees. "Why?" "Because your lineage is a bakery that's fed this capital for 2 generations. Because you stood in front of me and told the truth when every other woman in that hall was performing." His voice roughened. Voice breaks. "Because my hands have been steady my entire life, and I have never once wondered what it would feel like if they weren't. And then you stood in my hall with yours shaking, and something in me understood what it means to want to hold something still." The kitchen went quiet. Delia's heart was hammering so hard she could hear it in her ears, feel it in her throat, taste it at the back of her tongue. She stood up, crossed the 3 feet between them, and kissed him. Not gently, not tentatively. She kissed him the way she needed dough, with her whole body, with force and intention, and the desperate need to make something real out of raw materials. Her hands came up to his jaw and they were shaking, shaking. And then his hands covered hers, and they stopped. Still, anchored, home. He kissed her back like a man who had been holding his breath for days and had finally been given permission to exhale. His hand slid from hers to her waist, pulling her closer, and she felt the steadiness of him through every point of contact, his chest against hers, his palms warm through the fabric of her dress, his mouth moving against hers with a tenderness that made her eyes sting. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. His breathing was uneven. Her hands were still wrapped in his, pressed between their chests, absolutely motionless. "I'm going to cause you problems," she whispered. "A baker. In your selection. You're going to cause me everything." He pressed his lips to her forehead. "I'm counting on it." The formal accusation came 2 days later. Lyrian Orvan delivered it herself, standing in the center of the palace courtyard with a scroll of charges and an audience of every remaining selection candidate, their families, and half the court. Her silver-gray eyes were flat and precise as she read the allegations. Fraudulent presentation, deception of the crown, impersonation of a qualifying candidate, grounds for immediate expulsion from the capital, and a 5-year ban from royal events. The courtyard was packed. Morning light streamed through the arched colonnades, throwing long shadows across the stone, and every face in the crowd was turned toward Delia, who stood alone in the center of the flagstones, feeling like she was 12 years old again, watching her mother sit in the dark. She could see Calder on the upper gallery, standing, not sitting. His hands braced on the railing, his body angled forward, every line of him taut with barely controlled fury. He wanted to intervene. She could feel it. That anchor bond pulling between them, his steadiness reaching for her across the distance. She shook her head. Barely perceptible. Just for him. This one was hers. She waited until Lyrian finished reading. Let the silence stretch. Let the courtyard hold its breath. Then she stepped forward. "Everything the ceremony mistress has said is factually accurate." Her voice carried across the courtyard, clear and steady. "I did fake a limp. I did deceive the attendants. I did enter the hall, with the intention of avoiding the selection entirely." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Lyrian's chin lifted with satisfaction. "What the ceremony mistress has not mentioned," Delia continued, and something in her tone made the murmur die, "is that the selection registry requires only residency and age, not lineage, not title, not wealth." I checked. The original charter, written by the first Greyford Alpha, specifies that any unmated woman of age within the capital's borders has the right to be presented. The qualifying lineage requirement was added 3 years ago. She turned to face Lyrian directly. "By the current high ceremony mistress, without royal approval." The courtyard went very, very quiet. "I also couldn't help noticing," Delia said, her hands steady at her sides, steady as stone, steady as the man watching from the gallery above. "That of the 12 remaining candidates, 9 are from families with active trade agreements managed through the ceremony office. 3 of those agreements were signed in the last 6 months. All 3 by Mistress Orvain, personally." Lyrian's face drained of color. "That is a baseless— The contracts are filed in the Hall of Records, Shelf 14, Third Alcove, Eastern Wall. I read them yesterday." Delia held her gaze. "I'm a baker, Mistress Orvain. I know what it looks like when someone is measuring out ingredients to get a specific result." The silence that followed was seismic. Delia could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, in the arches of her feet, in the fine bones behind her ears, but her hands were still, perfectly, impossibly still. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps on the courtyard stairs, unhurried, deliberate. The crowd parted without being asked, and Calder Grayford descended into the courtyard with the focused calm of a man who had just watched someone rearrange the foundations of his kingdom and was adjusting accordingly. He stopped beside Delia, not in front of her, beside. His hand found the small of her back, a light pressure, warm and grounding. Mistress Orvain. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that preceded permanent consequences. You are relieved of your position effective immediately. An audit of the ceremony office's financial agreements will begin this afternoon. You will make yourself available for questioning. Lyrian opened her mouth, closed it. The courtyard watched as 2 guards stepped forward and escorted her out, and the only sound was the click of her heels on stone fading into nothing. Calder turned to face the courtyard. His hand stayed on Delia's back. The selection is concluded, he said. And then, to Delia, low enough that only she could hear, was that the 3rd shelf or the 4th? I want to make sure the auditors start in the right place. She almost laughed. Almost. Instead, she pressed her shoulder against his arm and felt the anchor bond hum between them, steady and certain, and she let herself lean into his warmth for just a moment. 3rd shelf, she whispered. I'll show you. 3 months later. The bakery was still open. Delia had insisted on that, and Calder had learned in the first week of their bond that arguing with Delia Fenmore about bread was the most efficient way to lose an argument he'd ever encountered. She baked in the mornings, rose before dawn the way she always had, padded through the palace corridors in bare feet, with flour already under her nails from the dough she'd mixed the night before, and worked in the palace kitchen until the first loaves came out golden and fragrant and perfect. The kitchen staff had resisted her presence for approximately 2 days before the smell of her sourdough won them over entirely. Calder appeared every morning at the same time. He'd come through the kitchen door with his hair still sleep-mussed, a dark pewter robe loose over his shoulders, and he'd sit on the same stool and watch her work with an expression that Delia had learned to translate as, I cannot believe you exist, and I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know it. This morning, he arrived earlier than usual. She was elbow-deep in rye dough when his arms came around her from behind, his chin settling on her shoulder, his warmth pressed along her back. You're up early, she said. Couldn't sleep? Bad dream? No. He turned his face into her neck. His voice was low, muffled against her skin. Good one. Wanted to check it was real. Her chest tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned in his arms. His eyes were soft in the pre-dawn lamplight, that dark pewter gone warm and liquid, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the ceremonial hall 3 months ago, like he'd found something he hadn't known he was looking for. The audit finished yesterday, he said. I know. Orvan's contracts have been voided. Every family that paid for preferential selection access has been notified. The charter's been restored to its original language. He paused. Your language. The baker who read the founding documents and rewrote my selection criteria from a kitchen stool. I didn't rewrite anything. I just pointed out what was already there. You pointed out what everyone else had been trained not to see. His hand came up to her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and she felt the anchor bond settle between them, warm and deep and steady. You know what I thought, that first day? When I saw you limping? That I was a terrible actress? That you were the most determined person in the room. Voice breaks. Every other woman in that hall wanted to be seen. You were the only one fighting not to be. And I thought, if she's working that hard to disappear, what is she so afraid of? What did someone do to make her believe she was better off invisible? Delia's eyes burned. She blinked hard. And then you carried me to the front of the line. And then I carried you to the front of the line. He pressed his forehead to hers. And your hand stopped shaking. And mine started. She pulled back. Looked at him. What? He held up his hands. In the lamplight, she could see it. a fine tremor running through his fingers, barely perceptible. He'd hidden it well. "Since the selection," he said quietly. "Since I touched you for the first time and felt the bond snap into place. My hands shake when you're not near me, and they stop the moment you are." His mouth curved. A real smile, rare and devastating. "We anchor each other, Delia. That's what this is. That's what it's always been." She looked at his trembling hands, reached out and took them in hers. The moment their fingers intertwined, both sets of hands went perfectly, absolutely still. She kissed him, slow, flower-dusted and warm and tasting of yeast and early morning and everything she'd been afraid to want. "I love you," she said against his mouth. Simply, the way you state a truth so fundamental it needs no decoration. His arms tightened around her. "I loved you before I knew your name. I loved you when you limped through my hall with the worst acting I have ever witnessed in my life. I loved you when you stood in the line and told me about your mother. I loved you when you kissed me in this kitchen like you were trying to prove something." He pulled back just enough to look at her. "I will love you when the bread burns and when the ovens go cold, and when you argue with me about charter law at 2 in the morning. That is not a vow. That is a fact." Delia laughed. Watery, bright. The kind of laugh that comes from a place so deep it's practically a sob. She pressed her face into his chest and felt his heartbeat under her cheek, steady and slow. And she thought about her mother sitting in the dark. And she thought about a 12-year-old girl burning 3 loaves of bread before the 4th one rose. And she thought about standing in a grand hall with her hands shaking and a king crossing the room to carry her forward. Behind them, the bread timer chimed. The first loaves were ready. Delia Fenmore, baker's daughter, Alpha King's mate, woman who had once faked a limp to avoid being seen, pulled the bread from the oven with steady hands and set it on the counter to cool. The kitchen filled with the smell of it. Warm, golden, honest. The smell of something made with time and attention and care. Calder stole a piece before it cooled. She let him. She always let him. And outside the kitchen windows, the capital woke to the smell of fresh bread coming from the palace, and no one who passed beneath those windows ever questioned where it came from, because by then, everyone knew. The Alpha King's mate baked bread every morning, and every morning, the king sat on a stool and watched her with pewter eyes and steady hands, and an expression that said, quite clearly, to anyone who cared to look, "This is the one I chose. This is the one who stood in my hall and told me the truth. This is the one whose hands taught mine what it means to be still."